right, what's up, girl and everybody else? Welcome back to episode 52 of our Faith and Whatever podcast, the show that is constantly teetering on the line of mediocrity. We are excited to be here tonight. As you can tell, we are a better-looking bunch than usual. We are joined with our head of intergalactic space missions, one Dr. Kip Lines. And Kip, we're really excited to have you on today. You wrote recently an article in the Christian Standard, which is, and by the way, pick up a hard copy of the Christian Standard because I got your article ahead of time, right, and have been reading it and kind of dissecting it. And you showed up with a hard copy tonight that has like 55,000 more pages of actual stuff that you have written on there. Yeah. So if you want to read this, where can they go and where can they find that before we jump into it?
Where can they find it? Well, they could find it online.
Okay.
Christianstandard.com. And online there, you can subscribe if you want to get a paper version of, let me rattle it around the microphone. If you want to get a paper version of the Christian Standard, you can order it online. You could also find it a lot of Christian churches get it and they put it in the lobby and
just have it.
Have it online.
I have zero idea how to order magazines.
You get it.
I've literally, I've never ordered a magazine.
I think it has something to do with a credit card.
I don't even know what that is. They don't give me those. So we're talking today about refugees and kind of just the Christian response to the refugee situation that's going on. And I have a million questions for you as somebody who is familiar with this, has delved into this, but has also, in one sense, kind of lived on the other side of it as well, right? And with your time in Kenya, and I'm super excited. So I just want to jump right in. So if you have been or haven't been following the news for the last couple of weeks, you know that there was an immigration ban that was put on by President Trump for the sake of kind of reworking our vetting system with the hoped trajectory, or the trajectory of hopefully accomplishing more extreme vetting processes, which I don't know if they've actually defined what those things are or what they're going to be there, but that's neither here nor there really for our purposes. What I'm more concerned with is the kind of the backlash that's kind of come out of that, right? As many people seeing this as a Muslim ban, rightly or wrongly, this is kind of just what's picked up steam in the main kind of in the media. And so we really wanted to talk about and kind of examine the concept of what the Christian response ought to be in the middle of this discussion, right? We have several issues to kind of discuss, and I think the first one we would say that I feel convicted to kind of at least talk about it or bring up is this sense of not creating refugees in the first place, right? Like kind of as a country, we probably have some really big responsibility in the 7 countries that have been so severely displaced over the last, even dating back to George Bush and certainly through, kind of the last administration with drone strikes and just the chaos has certainly been ensuing for the better part of, 2 decades, I guess.
For as long as America's been
America. I would say longer. War always creates refugees.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the main ways that people become refugees.
Yeah. And our foreign policy of kind of being the world policer, kind of since Truman, has not been, what's the best way to say it? What's the nicest way to say it? Has not been probably the most clean-handed foreign policy, right, in terms of the things that we've done and kind of the skirmishes and conflicts in which we've been involved as a country. So I think we would all start there and say, like, we need to at least recognize that we have a direct responsibility in terms of the chaos and the carnage that's been created in terms of we have voted these people into office, they have done things, and we have reelected them, we have not reprimanded them. But it seems with Trump lately, people are kind of starting to take up the mantle of that and kind of hold on to some of that responsibility. And, if we're starting here, we're kind of 70 years behind the 8 ball, but at least we're starting. And so we're trying to, get moving. So with that aside, and now moving into this conversation, would you just go ahead and give us just a little bit of a synopsis on your article and kind of what the Bible has to say about immigration and kind of what we can glean from it?
Sure, I can do that. The article that I wrote on what the Bible says about immigration, just trying to come up with, is there a stream of language that the Bible uses to talk about people who are refugees or immigrants who are living among us, and the way that we should treat those people who are living among us. So what I did first was talk about actually my own personal situation, thinking through the fact that all of us in America basically have come from immigrants. Like we have immigrant ancestors, right? I don't know if you know the story.
How far do ours trace back, Chris?
1609.
1609. All right, yeah, and my
White trash since 1609. Oh yeah.
But I mean, honestly, that's the story of America. American growth throughout the centuries that America has existed has been based on immigrants coming into the United States. It has been based on immigrants coming in and providing cheap labor often. And immigrants still see America as a place where you have opportunity, where there's considered to be, and we could debate this probably all night, a level playing ground for folks. That
level-ish, or more level-ish, or less unleveled.
There's this sense that if you work really hard, then you can do well in America. Right now, there are all sorts of barriers.
That's a very loaded discussion all the way around, for sure.
Right. So America is seen as that place, and there are success stories that people will talk about for immigrants. And my family came, families that are my ancestors originally came to Pennsylvania because of religious persecution in Europe. They were Anabaptists. And
those guys are the worst.
They were. No. They just love peace so much. They can't stand up for themselves. They flee. And then, so they ended up in Pennsylvania, which kind of made sense because Pennsylvania was this place that was set up as a state, not a state originally, but a place where people could flee religious persecution and practice their religion as they felt God had called them to practice it.
That's William Penn, right?
Yeah, William Penn.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of the Quakers moved to Pennsylvania.
I love their oatmeal.
You love their oatmeal. Maybe a different Quaker.
Yeah, could be.
I'm trying to think.
That could be.
So... Where were we? Yes.
Yeah, my fault.
So,
sorry.
As
riveting news here on Faith and Whatever.
Yeah, and I grew up in this strange situation of immigrants where, so I'm growing up in Pennsylvania around Amish and Mennonites and Anabaptists, but also around a whole bunch of Puerto Rican immigrants who had come to America, and there's kind of this trail of cities along the East Coast on the way up to New York City, where there's a large number of immigrants from Puerto Rico. So in my high school, it was 30-40% of the students were Puerto Rican. So I had that interaction with folks, and then I went to school in Tennessee, and that was the first time I realized that there's this large migrant labor force in America where people are traveling from farm to farm, and maybe families will come to America during a harvest time, live at a farm, work at a farm, and then return back to Mexico after the harvest is done, or they move on to another place where they can do harvesting. I had no idea that was happening in America, and that's when it hit me how much our economy relies on immigrants.
Yeah.
Like the fact that I could walk into a Taco Bell and buy a taco for I don't know how much it is.
I don't need Taco Bell ever.
I don't ever.
Yeah. Refuse.
I imagine it's cheap.
Yeah, like 30 cents maybe, 40s. I don't know.
Probably more than that.
Yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
But the tomatoes, the lettuce, I mean, all that stuff has to be hand picked.
Yeah.
Right, and someone does that very cheap. And so I had that experience with immigrants, and then when my wife and I went to Kenya and lived as missionaries in Kenya. I mentioned in the article, it really struck me that first time that I got an ID card from the government of Kenya. It said alien at the top. It had my picture on it.
Yeah, so what was the feeling like associated with that, just for you?
Well, I think growing up, you hear the term alien, and you automatically jump to the way people talk about illegal aliens. So to see, I'm an alien in this place, right?
Right.
It was disconcerting, recognizing that I'm living in a place where the government, they recognize me as being here, but they're not considering me part of them. Right. And at any time, they can withdraw my status and I have to leave the country. So, that to experience that and live it on that side and then recognize what people experience here helped me to be a little more sympathetic to that these are real people who are trying to take care of their families and find jobs and provide for a better future for their children. They're aliens. This is not their place, but they want it to be the place of their children.
Right.
Yeah.
So you cite some 21 examples through the scriptures of
in the Old Testament.
And some stories of scattering, as you label them. And I'm super appreciative of these because one of my frustrations kind of with the current discussion, I guess, on both sides of the political spectrum is we try and we have these discussions to talk about these things as if their side is the only legitimate side, right? So people who are against the concept of migration cite safety typically as the number one cause, which is a fair and valid concern. And people who are on the side of migration talk about new opportunities for new life and a better life because of war-torn countries, many of which we're responsible for, which is also a valid reason there. And so we so often talk past each other. I'm kind of limiting the scope and the parameters of the discussion just to those in the church there, I think, specifically for this. And so we don't realize that we're both kind of coming to our same well. We're all coming to the same well for the information that we're pulling out, right? So people against migration cite Romans 13, 1 through whatever, right, is obeying the law. And fair enough. And then we have these examples that really there's a bunch. And again, we'll link the article to this in the show notes and kind of in the description stuff so people can go and read it.
So what I wanted to do, instead of just having an argument for or against immigration, right, I wanted to look at how is immigration portrayed in the Bible. And what I found is it's part of God's mission. And I'm a missiologist. I teach mission and intercultural studies at Hope. So when I read the Bible, I'm looking for the way that God is reaching out to people and building relationships with people and calling people to be God's people. And it seems like migration, whether it's migration out of a place or coming into a place, is a common theme in the Old Testament. People were moving, and it was voluntary and it was involuntary. Sometimes there was famine and people had to go. They had to flee. They had to go to a place where there was food. Sometimes people intentionally left because God asked them to go. And sometimes there was another force or kingdom that came in and took siege of the place where people lived and forced them to move out.
Right.
I mean, so sometimes it was voluntary, it was involuntary, but through all of that migration, which seems to be a normal thing in human condition, God was working through it to bring people in relationship to him. So as the early church is scattered, we often talk about the way that, that's actually how early Christianity seemed to be spread, because of that scattering,
through diaspora,
through the persecution. So, what I find in the Bible is that migration is common. It's not something that we we need to be afraid of, and God works through it, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. And there's not a clear position in the Bible that says we should be pro-immigrant or anti-immigrant. I think what I find in Scripture is that God works through all of these human conditions and situations to work toward relationships with people.
Okay, so essentially you're saying pro or for or pro or anti, it just is.
It exists.
So this is something that we have to deal with. Okay, so that leads me into kind of my next question. I'm not the biggest fan of government all the way around. I just feel
I've picked up on that a little bit.
There seems to, and it feels like there's just a lot of fumbling of the ball there. But I do, in one sense, feel that government is necessary to a degree. I want there to be safety nets for people. I desire that in the sense of it feels like it's a necessary evil-ish to some degree in my estimation. And so because of that being a thing, can you give us, you were telling me off air, a fascinating difference of which I had zero concept about the difference between the refugee program and immigration in general. So can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, and I mean, some of that is my frustration with this current debate, is that people just lump together immigration as all just one thing in the United States, and it's not. The refugee program is actually only about, normally less than a tenth of the number of legal immigrants who come into the U.S. every year. So in 2016, the United States actually legally accepted over 1 million, just over 1 million immigrants into the United States. Now, many of them were students, so it's temporary visas. Many of them were temporary worker visas. Many of them were workers who are working for technology companies where they're all over the globe trying to find the best people who know a very specific thing, know how to do that thing well, and they get permission from the government to bring them into the United States. And then there's the refugee program, which is separate from all of those other immigration programs and visas that people can get. The refugee program is set up and is actually an agreement worldwide related to war. We basically agree with all of the nations of the world, specifically with NATO, that when wars happen in the world, we will share in taking care of the people who have to flee persecution, and people their lives are in danger if they stay where they live. Right. So the refugee program, every year, the president writes up a document saying, we're going to accept this many refugees this upcoming year, from each of these regions of the world. Normally, the range has been about 50 to 70,000 refugees each year. So again, we took in 1 million immigrants legally last year, and the refugee program only took in 70,000.
Okay.
Right? This upcoming year, the agreement between Congress and the president was 110,000 because they had added, I think maybe 30 or 40,000 additionally because of the Syrian crisis, which has, we were talking about this earlier, probably 4 million refugees just from Syria alone in the world today living in refugee camps because it's not safe for them to go home. So the argument right now, the thing that frustrates me in all of the discussion about immigration, is that the only thing that this order has tried to do in limiting immigration is reduce the number of refugees that we're taking in this year, and not allowing refugees from some specific countries, right? And so I actually think the refugee program works very well in the United States. Immigration reform hasn't happened in the U.S., major immigration reform, in over 50 years. So that needs to be reformed. But the refugee program itself, there's a very clear system of vetting already for a refugee. They're in a refugee camp. They're meeting with UNHCR folks and IOM folks who are working in those refugee camps. They go through an interview process. They go through background checks. They go through classes that teach them how to adjust to the place where they're going to go move to and live. And that really, most of them have gone through a process of at least 18 months in these refugee camps before they're then able to get on a plane and come to the United States within that limited quota of the number of refugees that we accept. And then what happens is they come into the U.S., and the federal government has partnered with refugee agencies all over the country who get volunteers, many times churches in their local area, to meet these refugees at the airport, to help them find an apartment or a house to live in, help them find their initial jobs, help them figure out how to get their kids in school, help them figure out how to pay the electric bill, all kinds of crazy stuff. And so the refugee program really helps to integrate people into their communities well and meet local people in the community. I don't see the refugee program as a threat to American safety, like you were saying. There are breakdowns in our immigration system that maybe people could slip through easier, but I don't see it happening in the refugee program.
So essentially, your stance would say, or your argument would be, to the major overhaul of the larger picture is not necessarily a bad idea, but the smaller subsect within the one is already constantly being changed, updated. And it's going through these things that probably actually just need to happen on the bigger level.
I would say that.
So so this is intriguing to me because I was watching a video the other day of a man who was talking with protesters at the airport, and he was just a random guy who was filming this, and he put on a shirt that made him look a little bit official and stuff, and walked around with a clipboard and asked people to sign up to be willing to take refugees into their homes, or to see it, kind of see it. And it's
see
a little
if they
bit,
would do that.
It's a little bit of a caricature and an oversimplification of the discussion. But of course, every single person that was on the video said no, and 10 people, something like that. And so my thought became then, if we adopt your line of reasoning and kind of extrapolate it, we say, okay, we accept, or it's just going to happen. People are just going to be here. Politics is always downstream of culture, right? And so we need to create a culture that isn't one that is dealing with fear mongering, that isn't one that is, pushing people towards isolation and, like you were saying, other things that might actually cause to, the roots of extremism to grow, if that's the case
right
there. But we need to be kind of out on the forefront there and welcoming people in and doing that. So in Southern California specifically, you've kind of touched on this, that there are organizations that people can get involved in. Are there just any ones that you, from your own knowledge, your own database, would just recommend that people kind of be a part of?
Yeah, and well, there's a website. Are you thinking specifically locally?
Because I just Googled refugee organizations near me, right?
Yeah.
And I found an article that said 9 ways to start helping. And
yeah, that's actually an advertisement. Don't click on that.
And whoops. The idea being, though, that it doesn't seem like it's that hard.
It's
to get
very,
involved
very easy
there
to find a refugee service organization in your local area that will. You sign up as a volunteer with them, and they have lots of specific tasks that they need. You don't have to. Nobody is going to ask you to host a refugee in your home.
Mm-hmm.
They have people who are helping refugees find housing. I've helped with refugees before. My wife and I have, where the only thing we were asked to do was to go to their apartment once a week and just talk to them in English and answer basic questions they have for an hour.
I mean, you're just literally helping them practice English.
Yeah,
assimilation, acclimation.
Helping them practice English, and while we're doing that, they're asking us questions like, well, what does this piece of mail mean that I got?
Yeah.
Because they don't quite understand. Is this a bill? Is this an advertisement?
Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
Okay.
And so they need people just to do that. They need people to buy basic essentials that you would just have in someone's apartment when they first arrive.
Mm-hmm.
They need people to meet folks at the airport and greet them. They need people who will drive them to doctor's appointments or to a job interview. I mean, there's just all kinds of simple things. I remember one of my favorite things when when Katie and I were working with this one family in Lexington, Kentucky. They would serve us food every time we went to their house, of course, because they were more hospitable than we were. Yeah. But one time we were there in the morning, and they were serving us orange soda as like orange juice, and they thought that was orange juice here. And so my wife went to the grocery store with the mother and the family, and she just didn't know where the orange juice was.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
I'm a big fan. Well, that would have been. I'm a huge fan of orange soda.
You love orange soda.
If she'd put that in the morning, that would have been like my favorite. I never would have left.
I mean, what I'm trying to say is there are very simple things that you could do to help.
Yeah.
And to offer hospitality, and I think the New Testament points to that for Christians. When there are strangers living among us, we're called to offer hospitality. And I could get into something else here if you want me to.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, sounds good to me.
Because you mentioned safety, and one of the big concerns in America is safety. It's a huge cultural value for us to have safety and security. And I think sometimes the gospel of following Jesus is at tension with our cultural value of safety and security. I mean, we follow Jesus who willingly died for others. Right? And there's a point where we've got to say, as Christians, we are willing to engage in things that aren't completely safe for the sake of Christ. So I'm willing to build a relationship with someone who's completely different from me, even though that's a little scary, because that relationship could lead not only to that person knowing God eventually, but it helps to break down these walls of isolation in our society, right? I think our communities would be better and stronger if more Christians would meet people who are not like them in their communities. There's a troubling statistic. So international students, that's not refugees. International students come in on temporary visas to study in universities in the States. 75% of international students who come to America never go inside an American home their entire time they're here going to school by the time they leave. 75% have never experienced hospitality in an American home. And so there are organizations that are helping churches and Christians link up with international campus ministries or even just the international student programs at a university. They're always trying to find homes where international students could just go and have dinner one night just to meet an American family.
Yeah.
As Christians, that's something we should be all about.
Yeah, that's like a softball straight over the middle of the plate. Yeah,
Easy stuff.
So, okay, so that's I think the most helpful thing is kind of being able to put faces to names. And so if that's the case, do you have an opinion personally on what you feel like the Christian stance should be, kind of as far as it relates to the governmental side, in terms of when we're saying, like, how much do we rely on the government as Christians? Because, again, Jesus doesn't directly discuss any of these things. And like you point out that he certainly was a subject of the empire of Rome in this time. But he also kind of talks about a division from, Christianity and nationalism, obviously, in terms of give to Caesar what is Caesar's, in that idea there. So do we get involved in the governmental side, or how, like, for somebody who wants to navigate these waters but doesn't kind of quite know, does that even matter? Do we need to worry about it? Like, in one sense, we can kind of put it to the side altogether, because they're going to be here regardless of whatever governmental policy gets into play. You will meet immigrants always, especially in Southern California. That's my favorite part about living here. But is there a way that we should be engaging the governmental side of the discussion insofar as our faith is concerned, that you can kind of speak to?
Well, I think as Christians, we should, from a faith perspective, we should be fully in favor of refugee programs and welcoming refugees into our communities and even into our faith communities. And also recognize that many of the immigrants who come to America actually are already Christians. I mean, that's the softball thing. That should be easy for Christians. It's hard for me. The political discussion in America today always seems to fall on, you either have to support this or this, and it seems like there's only two options, and that's so frustrating. I feel like as Christians, we live in this tension area because we always recognize that the lordship of Christ is what's supposed to be priority in our life, that we are actually Christians first before we are Americans. I don't know. That's probably fine with you, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree.
So we live in this tension. I think we should, as Christians living in America, be patriotic and supportive of our country and help our country be better. But at the same time, I think as Christians, we're called to be hospitable to strangers in our communities, and to love people in our communities that people don't love or care for. So, in some ways, I don't know where that falls on the political debate, because sometimes that makes me sound like a conservative, because I'm saying, the church should be out there doing all these things that the government is doing in our communities. Yeah, churches should be doing that, and Christians should be doing that. And on the other side, sometimes I sound like a liberal politically, because I think the government should be helping to make sure if people are falling through the cracks, to provide some assistance to those folks. So it's hard for me. I don't clearly hear politically what I want to say as a Christian. So maybe you could narrow it down for me and say, should Christians do this or this? I don't know.
Yeah, well, and because for me, it's almost become, in my personal feeling of it, the government uses kind of these two ways typically, in kind of incentivizing and then threat of penalty of some sort, right? And that feels inherently coercive to me in there, and I don't know how to reconcile that with the person and the character of Jesus, who seems fairly antithetical to coercion, and so I've kind of just, if I'm totally honest, sidestepped the question altogether and just have felt like this is going to be an issue regardless of who's in office or what policy comes down the pipeline, which is probably just going to be, piece of crap policy anyhow, because something's not going to get looked over, or some Republican's going to gut something in somewhere that takes out money. So I feel like it just feels like the conversation needs to only be had, in my opinion, on the individual level. They're like, we're in Southern California. I live spitting distance from a farm, right, where there are immigrants who are picking, lettuce and tomatoes and stuff all the time. And so for me, the thought has been lately, like, what can I do to get involved just in that one area, of where I'm at in Irvine? Like, how can I be better in terms of engaging people? Can I bring water? Can I, what is the thing I can do. And it doesn't feel like there's a need for the political conversation in that part of the discussion, but I feel like I'm almost being too myopic.
Yeah, so we should focus on what's local and who is in front of us, of course, as Christians. Politically larger, at a larger level, I think Christians should support the refugee program.
Yeah.
I don't see any reason why Christians can't support a refugee program and be involved in that. I think we should ask for immigration reform. Our politicians basically don't have the political guts to actually enact some real immigration reform. The reality is we have lots of immigrants living in America who are here that in a way that builds up our economy.
Right.
In a lot of ways, our economy is based on some of this cheap labor that comes from immigrants.
Did you see when?
And we recognize that, like Trump's businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. You like Georgia did that like 3 or 4 years ago, right? They kicked out all of the illegal immigrants and they rounded people up and blah blah, and their economy crashed like 30 or 40%. Like it just tanked there.
Well, we'll be paying twice as much for vegetables in the grocery store.
Right,
Yeah.
and so people, it feels like such a ginormous problem there that will never be solved in Washington ever, right? Because I've been starting kind of to go backwards in American history to read this, and Ben Franklin talks about the ending of American fabric by letting the German settlers come in, and then he ends up being one of the first people to publish his newspaper in German, right? So everything feels hypocritical, everything feels contradictory at best, and then just straight up racist at worst. I don't know what else to do at this point other than just engage in the communities around me, and just say, I'm just going to start, like, I'm not ever going to have political clout. I'm never going to run for any type of office because you can't have a soul and run for office, it feels like. So, like...
No. We need Christians to go into politics.
I just want to be with people, like, on the basement level or on the ground floor and just live life there with as little government.
I think you should be an Anabaptist.
And... Yeah, that sounds... actually, Kurt Williams, I follow his stuff, and he has made some very persuasive arguments to me.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting point about the history in America. This is nothing new. This debate about immigrants and migration is absolutely nothing new. I mean, early on, it was different types of Europeans. You said, Germans were looked down on. The Italians were seen as subhuman. The Polish people were seen as subhuman. The Irish were seen as less than everyone else. And the question, as they came into the United States, the question with people who lived in America was, how could they really be Americans? Right? But then they became assimilated in, and then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we were limiting immigrants from China, and we were worried about that. In World War II, the way that we treated the Japanese in internment camps. I mean, we have cycled through, and it's just kind of like, which of the newer immigrant groups is the group of the day that we're gonna be most afraid of.
The problem that scares me about that, though, is that like always leads to some type of horrific legislature getting passed, like the Chinese Exclusion Act, like internment camps there. So I just want to like avoid that on all levels, in kind of this newer discussion. But it feels inevitable.
When things start happening in our country that seem like they're headed toward that, I think Christians should raise their voices, definitely,
So we
speak up for those groups. I think Christians should be speaking up for Muslims in America today. It's a religious freedom issue too that Christians should be concerned about. If our government starts to limit the ways that people can worship God in the way that they see fit, we're only half a step away from limiting Christians. So it's interesting to see most Christians falling on the side of in agreement with we need to limit the amount of Muslims that are coming into our country. Whereas I want to say this is who America is. America is a nation made up of immigrants. America is a place where we have religious freedom. And if we really are going to have religious freedom, then it has to be freedom for all religions.
Well, Chris, you have any thoughts?
Nope.
They're pretty good. Okay, what's our time at?
34.
Okay, all right. Well,
I always make long videos.
These are good ones. These are good ones. So, all right. So we'll go ahead and we'll kind of, I guess, any final thoughts or anything. It feels like the takeaway that you're saying is like we need to be on the forefront of this.
Yeah,
Like,
and
there's no excuse. At
certainly,
this
as Christians at the local level, we need to be on the forefront of welcoming strangers, immigrants, refugees, being hospitable to people who are in need in our communities, and that just seems obvious to me. Then at a larger level, I think Christians should support a refugee program that truly is looking at people who are escaping terrible situations and inviting them into our country. And then beyond that, Matt, international students is a great place for Christians to get involved in ministry and meeting folks from all over the world. And then, I don't know what else to say there.
Yeah.
A Christian perspective on immigration is that I'm done.
Well, you heard it here first. Meh. Be sure to follow us. And do you have anything else you want to play? Or you got anything coming up soon in terms of any more publications?
No, nothing right now.
All right. So I'm on Twitter at Josh_Carmen. Garrett is at TStudentLife. James is at JamesYoile. Dr. Kip Lyons is probably too cool for you to get his Twitter handle. And Chris is at Marion Ranch. You can find us at faithandwhatever.com. If you like the video, be sure to like, subscribe, and share, and let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks so much for watching.